Okay, so I'm going to be talking about. Actually, that's weird the way that's gone. That's not supposed to be like that. I'm going to be talking about prevent in Birmingham, and can it be constructive? And one of the things that, and I'll show you in a bit the kind of engagement and interaction I've had with Prevent in Birmingham, and I've kind of moved and engaged in various different ways, and probably in ways that there's not many people that have kind of had that same interaction and engagement with it as maybe I have, and I think it kind of puts me in a kind of privileged but also an unprecedented position. And so one of the things that I'm going to try and do today is to try and draw out some informed opinion. As a means of trying to construct a critical kind of narrative or kind of discourse around prevent in Birmingham, and about whether or not I think it's working, and which takes me into the magician role. I realise, in terms of that. These are the things that we're going to look at today. I'm just going to kind of give a little overview in terms of that, and because of the kind of wealth of kind of information and kind of engagement I've had, it's very difficult about trying to get that into a very small kind of presentation. And so what I've done is I've kind of narrowed it down to a kind of couple of bookends. So I'm going to bookend my experiences in engagement. I'm going to look at my first start of engagement, and then look at the end point and try and kind of consider some change which has kind of gone through, which has occurred throughout that period. Look at the transition, and then look at kind of change and challenge, and then also raise some questions in terms of kind of, which hopefully kind of fit with the two presentations previously. So for those of you who don't know, very quickly, prevent is one part of the counter-terrorism strategy. You can see there: pursue, prevent, protect, prepare. Prevent is there to stop people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. Now, if I'm going to come on to this in a moment, but this one, I guess, is probably the most contentious and the most controversial. If you listen to, if you're kind of in the kind of the criticism space, you would see that the criticisms are directed at this because of this notion that it occurs in the kind of pre-criminal space, and that you're kind of acting in that space to try and identify people who may or may not go on to do something which they may or may not do at a later time, as a means of trying to kind of preempt and kind of stop that. So it becomes very kind of like contentious and complex in terms of that. Now, if you kind of, so this was a very kind of like my relationship with Prevent in Birmingham. And there's another little bit on the bottom, which I'm not quite sure why everything's gone in that kind of weird sized text. My involvement started back in 2006 when I was Director of Policy at Birmingham Race Action Partnership. And we sat, so my role was to first engage when it was the kind of PVE Pathfinder Fund. So Birmingham was identified as one of the kind of key areas where this kind of prevent violent extremism activity was required. And I went in there really very much on a kind of community advocacy role. So very different to say where I am, where I was, say maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. And if you look across that list, I mean, I've been in there in terms of a practitioner, I've been in there in terms of an employee, I've kind of engaged with it as an academic, I've community advocacy, and also as a citizen of the city as well. So that that combined becomes very difficult, because in many ways what I'm doing is I'm coming at this from a lot of different subjective viewpoints, and as part of that, trying to then create that kind of narrative around, to try and bring together some sort of thinking, some sort of kind of informed opinion, which hopefully will be able to kind of like shape my kind of like the conclusions that I reach at the end. But I think it is interesting the kind of looking at the way in which I've engaged with it and the kind of way in which it's changed, and the different positionalities as well. And so at times I've kind of been working as a kind of insider, whereas other times I've been very much more an outsider. And so, that in itself kind of changes the relationship within which we kind of understand it. Now, I think that before we go into the kind of Birmingham, we have to kind of consider the national context, because I think that there's a sharp dichotomy between the kind of local and the national. I think that there's also as well as a kind of a contention between the kind of perceptions and the realities as well. And that's not without, and I'm not making any kind of value judgments in terms of that. At the national level, we largely see this kind of like, it's very much black and white. You're either pro-prevent or you're kind of against prevent. And the kind of massive grey area in the middle, where most people tend to sit, is pretty much lost in the kind of national debate. So we see a couple organisations such as MEND and CAGE, for example. I would say that they are kind of almost in that kind of professional opposition position, where they will actively seek to kind of like, oppose prevent in all its forms and manifestations. And then you get others kind of like sort of the NUS, National Union of Students, for example, UCU working together as a means of trying to kind of engage and question and raise awareness. And depending upon your politics, you would either see that as fitting, kind of like in that kind of grey space, or maybe in the kind of opposition spaces as well. But I think that there's some differences in terms of that. But at the national context, you've got this kind of very, opposition is really the kind of word. And then, of course, you have this kind of the notion of a toxic brand. Prevent becomes a toxic brand. And on the left, we have Dal Babu, excuse me, who spoke about Prevent being a toxic brand. And then on the right, we have Andy Burnham, again talking about this being toxic. So you can see at that national level, it's a very, very kind of like a very specific and very clear understanding that Prevent is a problem, that it's something which, like sort of as Andy Burnham says there, has to be scrapped. Now, I guess the start point is, we can kind of step back in terms of that. And irrespective of whether it's Prevent or whether it's something else, or, is there a need for this type of program? Is there a need for this type of kind of initiative? And I think that, like my personal view is that, yes, there is the need for this. But actually, this kind of like, contentious kind of view is something which creates problems, which makes it very difficult to be able to look at in terms of that. And then we see as well, at that national context, you can look at the kind of like, the kind of scholarly literature, and we see that, again, Prevent is very much seen to be a problem. Prevent is very much seen to be something which is about kind of scrutiny, it's about spying, it's about something which reinforces the notion of Islamophobia, it reinforces kind of stereotypes, it kind of like, to an extent where it's kind of seen as being a kind of top-down imposition of kind of trying to establish or construct a kind of state-endorsed British version of Islam, And so if you look across the scholarly literature, you will find that these are kind of like the kind of broad themes in which they kind of work. There is very little in terms of scholarly literature which actually sort of presents Prevent as being something which is positive. Very little, in terms of kind of looking at it through the lens of, something which is like kind of works, something which is kind of like sort of there and it's necessary. So, so just to try and create that and kind of put that into perspective. So when I was at BRAP, as it was known, Birmingham Race Action Partnership, one of the things that we saw with this very early kind of, kind of like the kind of model of Prevent was that it was a very poorly conceived. If you look back in terms of the kind of independent evaluation, you'll see that the kind of there was things around kind of taking school kids to Mecca, to go on pilgrimage to Mecca. There would be things about kind of try and target women, target young people. These very kind of broad brush kind of approaches, which kind of like reinforce this kind of idea that actually sort of, is this about kind of preventing people from being radicalised and drawn into extremism and terrorism, or is this about actually kind of reinforcing, kind of working within Muslim communities in terms of kind of trying, kind of filling the void maybe that's left around kind of youth projects, around austerity cuts to kind of youth programmes and so on. And I guess that what this really was it kind of fit into this kind of idea that it was a front for surveillance. Because, of course, if you're funding, to take kids to on a pilgrimage to Mecca, if it's being funded by something which is from a counter-terrorism strategy, you're kind of looking at it and saying, well, why would that be? Are we being spied on? Are we being looked at while we're kind of there? And actually, when you begin to kind of unpack this, what you kind of get is that there's a kind of, you see that it's really poorly conceived. You see that the funds were going to almost specific families, like you could see the kind of relationship networks. You could see that those organisations were from a very particular background. And I guess that, if you're looking at this kind of trying to be objective, you can say that a lot of actually sort of organisations and community projects which were funded at that kind of very early stage was really about kind of like filling the void. There was an opportunism there really that sort of, there's no funding to run these projects, so let's kind of take prevent funding, or let's take the kind of Pathfinder funding and kind of look at that. And so as I wrote when I was at BRAP, we can dismiss them. Some of them are trivialised, some of them were dismissed, were just mere tokenistic. But it was always about being questioned. They was always very questionable as to whether they were sort of, they were working or not. And then, in this kind of bottom, the bottom quote there was that, even back here, in 2008, we were talking as an organisation about, the evidence. How can we prove that these are working? How can we prove that taking some kids on a pilgrimage is actually going to stop them from becoming radicalised or drawn to extremism when they're here? And so, this notion of kind of like chasing red herrings, but also this idea, how do you go about, preventing violent extremism? One of the things that came out of this was the Birmingham's independent evaluation, and you get these kind of very broad kind of ideas, like there's no real kind of depth to the analysis, and you get this kind of like, you get from the independent evaluation right at the start that actually, this is a very, very poorly conceived and very, very poorly implemented kind of program. And this kind of last spot at the bottom quote, focus on the side of the wall where young people are hanging around. I mean, it's so broad and bland and meaningless that actually it's very, very difficult. Just to go with that, I always like to show this. That was the diagram which went with that quote. And what's really interesting is that you to see just how poorly conceived prevent was. This again, so it's very. This is mainstream Muslims, this is informed Muslims, and this is Muslims who might be drawn to extremism. So it's not to any scale whatsoever. There's no kind of like, there's no actual sort of, empirical evidence behind it. It's just this idea, this is a tiny minority as well. And I always like the way on every page they also, to kind of reinforce the point, was to kind of put a photo of the 7/7 bus attack in London, just to remind you, if you're reading it, just exactly what this was about. So it was so poorly conceived that even the kind of independent review evaluation kind of like sort of, failed to really address any of the issues which we're kind of talking about. And then it kind of comes in. So what I would say is that actually this was what fed this seedbed within the city, was that actually the context at the national level was being reinforced at the local level as well. And so, you were starting in the city of Birmingham from like kind of 10 steps behind in terms of that. And then we got a few kind of quotes there, and they're not all there. And I think that one of the things that we kind of like realise is that in this kind of middle period, there's been some real challenges in terms of Birmingham, and these are not direct, issues around prevent, but they have contributed to shaping the view of Muslim communities, and I use that, in its plural, and not as a kind of homogenous kind of way. But it shapes Muslims' views in the city. It shapes a lot of the views of those individuals who are maybe at the kind of, being able to engage, being able to kind of shape and inform opinion. So we have Project Champion, the 200 plus cameras around two areas. This idea, that was the, overt and covert cameras. This idea that actually this is about countering crime, but actually the reality was it was a kind of counter-extremism, counter-terror issue. Operation Trojan Horse, reinforcing within, kind of Muslim communities this idea that actually with those Muslim communities in Birmingham are being targeted, in ways that Muslims in other cities are not. And then, the notion of problem city, the jihadi capital. This idea that actually those on the outside looking in, can see Birmingham as being a problem city, where, the notion of extremism and radicalisation is so great that it actually probably needs special measures or needs to be dealt with, specific, in a specific way. And this idea that with all of this, this creation of no smoke without fire, and you can take that whichever way you want. Are the Muslim communities in Birmingham problematic? Well, there's no smoke without fire. Yes, they are. Are we being scrutinised and surveyed, and are we kind of being spied upon? Well, there's no smoke without fire. So yes, we probably are. So this works both ways in terms of that. And so just kind of bringing on to kind of contemporary change and looking at, if we go back to that timeline, engaging in different ways with kind of the Prevent teams and kind of going on the kind of exchange program to Denver last year. And what you see is that this kind of like, these earlier project types have all disappeared. There's been a complete reversal of the type of approach in the way in which what's been funded, what's been used in terms of Prevent. A much more kind of openness in terms of the teams that are running Prevent, and also more access and accountability. But also kind of a better kind of public articulation for the need for Prevent and what some of these, what some of the issues are in terms of that. It's one of the things that came out of a stakeholder roundtable that I facilitated last year was this idea that actually sort of, the kind of events in Syria, for example, have begun to change the kind of views of kind of certain Muslim families, and by kind of like that kind of the ripple effect of Muslim communities as well, in terms of the kind of positive impacts that kind of Prevent and counter-terrorism strategy can have in terms of kind of kind of supporting families in terms of safeguarding them rather than securitizing them. So you get a very clear kind of move from that. And then as well, we get from the stakeholder table, this idea that actually, there's more and more programs being run, there's more initiatives being run around kind of preventing violent extremism, and as a way, and that is in itself an evidence of greater buy-in. I realise I've got very little time left, so I'll just run on very quickly. One of the things we did as well in terms of that was this was very much a clear kind of thing that the kind of top was that there is now a kind of conscious kind of discourse, but also a conscious effort to kind of move Prevent away from security to around safeguarding. Very much framing it in a different way, very much framing it as in kind of what actually Prevent offers and what it kind of achieves. And that, in itself can become a very kind of positive or kind of very beneficial message. We did a youth roundtable as well. What was interesting there was that, that obviously in terms of, young Muslims in Birmingham, there's still this sense that actually they're being watched and spied on and so on. But what came out was that it was really interesting was that Prevent was seen to be a problem at the national level, not at the local level. So this kind of like, this shift to what we're seeing in Birmingham seems to be kind of filtering through, and obviously we need to kind of undertake more research and so on, but in terms of that, there seems to be a lot. So, change. What have we seen? So we've seen this kind of a significant change in the way in which Prevent has been delivered and conceived and designed in Birmingham. Huge change in that kind of 10, 12 years that we've kind of moved from. A kind of move from the transition from security to safeguarding, and that kind of works through in terms of that. And what you get with that is a much more kind of targeted and meaningful intervention. The programs, the initiatives, the way in which it kind of functions seems to be much more kind of informed by the notion of safeguarding than security. You see that Prevent has widened. If you go back 12 years, and they always told us, if you look at the kind of formal documents around kind of Prevent and counter-terrorism strategy, they spoke about animal rights extremism and so on, but it was always kind of very, very tokenistic. What you're seeing now in Birmingham is a change, is that, other groups and other forms of extremism are being taken into consideration, and the referrals, you can see, reflecting this kind of change as well. With that though, like sort of while you can see that within stakeholders, to what extent can you still see this in terms of like kind of communities that grassroots and others, and so I think that, in terms of that, whilst we can pull together something which we're going to suggest this is occurring, actually there needs to be kind of more evidence in terms of that. In terms of challenges, I think that the biggest challenge is the kind of legacy of Prevent, whether that's a legacy at the local level, the kind of project champion, or whether that's the kind of legacy of the toxic brand at the national level. I think that is still a massive challenge that needs to be overcome in terms of kind of Prevent in the city. I think that like sort of it's very difficult to kind of fall into that kind of blind advocate kind of role, in terms of the black and white of the opponents and the advocates. And actually sort of, one way of trying to change perceptions and trying to challenge that discourse could see actually those who are working within Prevent and seeing it as a positive actually falling into that kind of dichotomous relationship, which again, maybe it's, a much more nuanced kind of understanding needs to be, brought out in that. Prevent in Birmingham does seem to be working, but how do you kind of measure that? I mean, is a larger, and it's almost contradictory. So you could say Prevent is working because there's more referrals, but also you could say that Prevent's working because there's less referrals as well. And your positionality and your subjectivity would actually inform which one of those is evidence of it working or not. So so how we would normally measure and kind of evidence these kind of things becomes very difficult in terms of that. And I think that there is a problem that what's positive in Birmingham, working in Birmingham, can still be challenged at that national level, particularly from national government. So they're the four final things. It can be constructive, it continues to be, it's transitions and transformed. And really what we need there is more meaningful evidence, and particularly evidence of that change. And also meaningful evidence of success as well. So thanks very much.